Aaron Rodgers' return means bad news for Steelers' Will Howard. Just based on the perspective of following the status quo and attempting to be the best version of themselves for the 2026 season, re-signing Aaron Rodgers was always the most sensible quarterback move for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Though Rodgers inflates the Steelers' odds of a return trip to the playoffs for a fourth year in a row, the veil of uncertainty surrounding the team's young quarterbacks isn't going to dissipate in 2026. Seizing Drew Allar's opportunity to make a splash as a rookie who was never likely to see the field, considering Pittsburgh is building him from the ground up from a mechanical standpoint, is not malpractice, but Will Howard is in a different boat. Howard's in a rough spot. With Steelers, rarely does a sixth-round quarterback rustle up the magnitude of razzmatazz that Howard has in his brief stint as a Steeler up to this point. His collegiate resume surely is at the center of that fanfare, as Howard helped lead the Ohio State Buckeyes to a national title in his lone season with the program in 2024. Most of the reports that arose from rookie minicamp and training camp last offseason were favorable as well, and it appeared as though Howard was on the fast track to being championed as Rodgers' successor and Pittsburgh's next franchise signal caller. A freak hand injury he sustained on a center exchange during training camp wiped out his entire preseason and landed him on the reserve/injured list up until week 11, though, essentially rendering his rookie campaign a wash. Immediately upon Mike McCarthy being hired as the Steelers' head coach, a week and a half after Mike Tomlin stepped down back in January, he spouted loads of positive rhetoric about Howard. "I'm really excited about Will Howard. I think he's someone that I thought he really came on there at Ohio State," McCarthy said during his introductory press conference. "I'm anxious to work with him." Howard split first-team reps with Mason Rudolph during voluntary minicamp just ahead of the 2026 NFL Draft, and while Rodgers' return was always looming ahead, the 24-year-old seemed like he was getting every chance in the world to set himself apart and prove that he could one day take the reins. Now that Allar, a third-round pick, is in the fold and was handpicked by McCarthy, Howard has more or less become the forgotten man between the pair. Add in the fact that Rodgers is back in town, and Howard has no path to playing time this season. Sure, he's going to take plenty of reps during the preseason, but even a strong performance likely won't be enough to sway the Steelers' minds in terms of his future with the organization. In a best-case scenario for Howard, he'll continue to develop throughout the season while serving as Rodgers' backup before battling for the starting job with Allar and potentially a rookie in 2027. The reality of the situation, however, is that it's tough to project a long-term stay in Pittsburgh for Howard. 2026 was his real and maybe only shot to be QB1. Rodgers will prevent him from taking that step, and with the team potentially looking to take a signal caller early in next year's draft, coupled with Allar's presence, he is quickly becoming the odd man out. The return of Aaron Rodgers to the Pittsburgh Steelers for the 2026 season might look, on the surface, like a move built for stability. A proven veteran quarterback, a familiar system, and a roster constructed to compete right now. But beneath that surface-level logic, the decision sends a very different message to the younger quarterbacks in the building, especially Will Howard. For Pittsburgh, this is no longer about experimenting with upside or accelerating a rebuild. It is about squeezing every remaining ounce of value out of a short championship window. Rodgers gives them that. But what it also does is quietly close doors for the developmental timeline of the players behind him. Will Howard entered Pittsburgh as a developmental quarterback with intrigue rather than guarantees. A sixth-round selection who flashed enough at Ohio State to earn respect, but not enough consistency to be handed a starting role at the next level. Still, there was a pathway, a real one. The kind that exists in NFL organizations when the veteran starter is aging and the backup job is genuinely up for grabs. That pathway now feels significantly narrower. Howard's rookie journey was already disrupted before it could fully begin. A hand injury during training camp erased valuable preseason reps, stalled his momentum, and forced him into a reactive rather than developmental role throughout the year. For a young quarterback, those early reps are not just important, they are foundational. Without them, the learning curve becomes steeper and the margin for error shrinks immediately. When Mike McCarthy arrived as head coach, there was at least a sense that Howard would be given a clean slate. Coaches often speak in broad optimism during introductory press conferences, but McCarthy's comments about Howard carried a slightly more intentional tone. He didn't dismiss him as a project buried on the depth chart. Instead, he pointed to real excitement about his college progression and the belief that he could grow into something more. That mattered because in the NFL, opportunity often starts with perception. If a coach believes you are worth developing, you get time. You get reps. You get chances to fail. But the quarterback room in Pittsburgh has now shifted dramatically. Aaron Rodgers is the starter. That is not a competition. It is a hierarchy. Drew Allar, a third-round investment with clear organizational backing, represents the long-term developmental bet. That leaves Howard in the middle. Not the future, not the present, and not clearly prioritized in either direction. That is the most difficult position for any young quarterback to occupy. The reality is that Howard's most meaningful chance to seize control of his NFL trajectory may have already passed. Even if he performs well in preseason action, those performances are often evaluated in context, not isolation. Teams weigh draft capital, coaching preferences, and long-term projections more heavily than short exhibition flashes. And in Pittsburgh's current structure, those evaluations are already tilting elsewhere. Rodgers' presence limits Howard's access to meaningful game reps. Allar's presence limits Howard's internal ranking within the developmental hierarchy. And the possibility of Pittsburgh investing again in a quarterback in future drafts adds another layer of uncertainty. In that environment, survival becomes the primary objective. Not progression, not competition, but simply staying in the building long enough for circumstances to change. The best-case scenario for Howard is gradual development behind Rodgers, learning the nuances of an NFL offense while absorbing the mental side of the position. In that scenario, he could still re-enter the conversation in 2027 when roster dynamics inevitably shift again and Pittsburgh reevaluates its quarterback structure. But the worst-case scenario is far more likely in league terms. A crowded quarterback room, limited snaps, and a coaching staff forced to prioritize immediate results over long-term grooming. That combination has ended many developmental quarterback careers before they ever truly began. What makes this situation more complicated is timing. Howard's rookie year was supposed to be the foundation. Instead, it became a setback year defined by injury and lost opportunity. His second season now arrives not as a step forward, but as a crowded evaluation window with fewer openings than expected. That is why Rodgers' return matters so much beyond the headline. It does not just affect the starting lineup. It reshapes the developmental ecosystem around every quarterback in the building. For Pittsburgh, the logic is simple. Compete now, stabilize the position, and avoid uncertainty at the most important spot on the field. For Howard, the logic is far less forgiving. Wait, develop, and hope that opportunity reappears in a future that is never guaranteed in the NFL. And that is the quiet truth behind this move. It is not just about Aaron Rodgers starting another season. It is about how many doors stay open for the quarterbacks behind him and how quickly those doors begin to close. Aaron Rodgers' return to the Pittsburgh Steelers for the 2026 NFL season is one of the most debated quarterback decisions of the year, and for good reason. On the surface, it looks like stability, a veteran Hall of Famer, a proven winner, and a player who still flashes moments of brilliance. But underneath that surface, this move raises bigger questions about direction, identity, and whether Pittsburgh is truly building for the future or simply delaying the inevitable. Rodgers is now 42 years old, entering what is likely the final stretch of his NFL career. Even for a quarterback with his resume, 4 MVP awards, a Super Bowl title, and over 2 decades of elite-level experience, the physical and mental demands of the league eventually catch up. What Pittsburgh saw last season was not peak Rodgers, but a version that is still capable of managing games, limiting mistakes, and delivering occasional high-level throws when the system around him is working. That distinction matters more than people realize, because the Steelers are not just asking Rodgers to survive the season. They are asking him to elevate a roster that is somewhere between rebuilding and contending. and that is where the tension begins. Last season, Rodgers helped Pittsburgh reach 10 wins and an AFC North title, which on paper looks like success. But context changes the story. The Steelers' offense often lacked explosiveness, drives stalled in key moments, and when they finally reached the postseason, the gap between competent and elite became obvious. The wildcard loss to Houston wasn't just a defeat. It was a reminder that veteran leadership alone cannot compensate for structural offensive limitations. Rodgers' stat line in that playoff game, 146 yards, 0 touchdowns, and an interception, was not an outlier in terms of modern postseason quarterback standards. It was a reflection of a broader issue. Pittsburgh's offense is functional, but not dangerous enough to compete with the league's elite defenses when the game slows down. Still, the Steelers doubled down. Instead of aggressively pursuing a long-term successor in the draft, they leaned back into familiarity. Rodgers returned on a one-year deal worth up to $25 million, a number that reflects respect for his reputation more than his current production level. That decision alone tells you what Pittsburgh is prioritizing right now: competitiveness over transition. But this is where the trap narrative begins to form. The idea is simple. Rodgers is good enough to keep the Steelers relevant, but not necessarily good enough to take them further than they went last season. That creates a dangerous middle ground. Not bad enough to rebuild properly, not good enough to truly contend for a championship, just stuck in the cycle of winning enough games to avoid a top draft pick while also falling short of the ultimate goal. That is what critics like Skip Bayless are pointing to when they call this move a mistake. From that perspective, Pittsburgh is not solving a problem, they are maintaining it. However, that argument only tells part of the story, because the Steelers are not operating in a vacuum. The quarterback market is thin, the draft class did not offer a clear franchise-altering option at their slot, and the coaching staff believes the roster still has enough talent to compete. In that environment, Rodgers becomes less of a long-term answer and more of a calculated bridge. A bridge to what, though? That is the real question. The organization's recent moves suggest trying to maximize the present window. Adding experienced weapons like Michael Pittman Jr. and complementary depth pieces shows a clear intention. Give Rodgers enough support to make the offense functional, and let the defense and structure carry them deep into January. But even with those additions, the ceiling question remains. Rodgers at this stage of his career is no longer the quarterback who can consistently create offense out of broken plays or dominate through improvisation. His game now relies more on timing, precision, and decision-making. That works in structured systems, but it also becomes predictable over time. And in the playoffs, predictability gets punished. Another layer to this situation is the coaching dynamic. The arrival of Mike McCarthy creates familiarity, given their shared history and success in Green Bay. The two have already built a championship-level foundation together, which is part of why Pittsburgh feels comfortable betting on this pairing again. Their past success, 107 wins together, gives the organization confidence that they can recreate at least some version of that formula. But history is not always repeatable in the NFL. Systems evolve, defenses adapt, and players age. What worked a decade ago does not automatically translate to a new roster, a new division, and a new physical reality for the quarterback. So, the Steelers are betting on continuity in a league that is constantly forcing change, and that is where Mason Rudolph and the younger quarterbacks enter the conversation. While they are not currently viewed as franchise solutions, their presence highlights another concern: development delay. Every season spent prioritizing short-term stability is another season where younger quarterbacks do not get meaningful reps. That slows down the pipeline, and it increases pressure on the organization to find the next answer sooner rather than later. In that sense, Rodgers' return does not just affect wins and losses, it affects timeline management. If Pittsburgh wins a playoff game or two, the decision looks justified. If they repeat last season's outcome, the criticism becomes louder, and the organization will be forced back into the same quarterback search cycle with even less flexibility. There is also the emotional component that cannot be ignored. Rodgers is still one of the most recognizable names in football. He brings attention, media coverage, and credibility to a team that has been searching for postseason relevance for years. For ownership and fans, that matters. It creates engagement, optimism, and the belief that this year might be different. But belief and reality are often two different things in the NFL. The uncomfortable truth is that Pittsburgh is now walking a very narrow line. On one side is relevance, winning enough games to stay in the playoff conversation. On the other side is stagnation, being good but not good enough for multiple seasons in a row. Rodgers is the player who stabilizes that line. He prevents collapse, he avoids chaos, but he also may not be the player who pushes them beyond it. That is why this move feels so polarizing. It is not obviously right or obviously wrong. It sits in the middle where most NFL decisions actually live. If everything goes well, if the offensive line holds up, if the new weapons integrate quickly, and if Rodgers can stay healthy deep into the season, Pittsburgh absolutely has a path to playoff success. But that path is narrow, and it requires near-perfect execution. If anything breaks, the limitations of the roster and quarterback become exposed quickly. So when analysts call this a trap, what they really mean is this. The Steelers may have chosen the safest version of competitiveness instead of the boldest version of progress. And in today's NFL, safety does not always lead to championships. It leads to seasons that look solid on paper, feel frustrating in reality, and ultimately force the same questions to be asked again a year later. For Aaron Rodgers and the Steelers, 2026 is not just another season. It is a test of whether experience can still overcome decline, whether structure can still elevate aging talent, and whether Pittsburgh is still comfortable living in the space between hope and transition. Because that space, more than anything, is where NFL franchises either stay stuck or finally decide to move forward. The Pittsburgh Steelers finally made their decision. After months of speculation, delays, rumors, and frustration from fans, Aaron Rodgers is officially back for the 2026 season. And while the move instantly raises Pittsburgh's floor as a football team, it also reveals something much bigger about the organization's mindset right now. This is not a move built around the future. This is not a move about developing Drew Allar. This is not a move about seeing what Will Howard can become. And it is definitely not a move designed to help Pittsburgh find its next franchise quarterback. This is a move built around one thing only: ending the Steelers' embarrassing playoff drought before the pressure around the organization becomes unbearable. Because make no mistake, that drought is now defining this franchise. For years, Pittsburgh has tried to balance two completely different timelines at once. They have tried to remain competitive every season while also quietly searching for the next long-term quarterback after Ben Roethlisberger retired. The problem is that approach has left them stuck in the middle. Not bad enough to reset, not good enough to truly contend. And now Aaron Rodgers has become the latest attempt to delay a rebuild nobody inside the organization wants to admit is probably necessary. That is why this signing feels so short-sighted to many fans. On the surface, it makes sense. Rodgers is still experienced. He still protects the football well. He still understands defenses at an elite level mentally. And compared to the alternatives currently on Pittsburgh's roster, he probably does give the Steelers their best chance to win games immediately. But that is also the problem. The Steelers are once again prioritizing immediate respectability over long-term clarity, and that exact strategy has trapped them for years. When you look at Rodgers honestly at this stage of his career, the reality becomes difficult to ignore. He is no longer an elite quarterback physically. The mobility is mostly gone. The ability to consistently extend plays is fading. The deep passing aggressiveness that once terrified defenses has become far more conservative. Even statistically, the warning signs were all over his 2025 season. The raw numbers looked decent enough. Over 3,300 passing yards, 24 touchdowns, only 7 interceptions. But advanced metrics painted a completely different picture. Rodgers ranked near the bottom of the league in several efficiency categories, including intended air yards, success rate, and time to throw. The offense often became methodical, slow, and overly cautious. That version of Rodgers can still help a team stay competitive, but can it realistically carry a franchise to a Super Bowl? That feels much harder to believe. And deep down, The Steelers probably know that too, which is why this move feels less about chasing a championship and more about avoiding embarrassment. The Steelers have not won a playoff game since the 2016 season. For a franchise that built its reputation on stability, toughness, and championship standards, that drought is becoming impossible to ignore, especially because Pittsburgh has continued avoiding the type of collapse that would force a full organizational reset. They keep finishing around 500. They keep staying competitive. They keep hanging around the playoff race. And every season ends the same way. No real postseason success and no clear franchise quarterback solution. Rodgers now becomes the latest attempt to temporarily patch that problem. Because if the Steelers can sneak into the playoffs and finally win a postseason game, ownership can justify the direction they have taken. The front office can claim patience worked. Mike McCarthy can stabilize his first season, and the organization can buy itself more time before having to fully confront the future. That is the real goal here. Not necessarily a championship. Survival, narrative control, avoiding a decade-long playoff win drought. And honestly, Rodgers probably does help them accomplish that more than any other quarterback currently available. That is what makes this situation so complicated. Because the move is understandable, but understandable does not necessarily mean smart long-term. The biggest consequence of Rodgers returning is what it means for the younger quarterbacks behind him. Before Rodgers signed, there was at least a possibility that Pittsburgh could spend 2026 evaluating its future. Fans were excited about seeing what Drew Allar could become under Mike McCarthy's development system. Others were curious whether Will Howard might surprise people with his toughness and leadership. Now, both quarterbacks likely spend another season watching from the sidelines. That may not sound disastrous at first, but it creates a dangerous timeline problem. If Rodgers starts all season and Pittsburgh wins 9 or 10 games again, they probably draft outside the range needed to select a top quarterback prospect in 2027. That means the Steelers could once again enter another offseason without a clear long-term answer. Meanwhile, Allar and Howard still remain mostly projections rather than proven options. That is why many fans wanted Pittsburgh to turn the page now instead of delaying the inevitable. Because eventually the franchise must stop prioritizing short-term competitiveness over finding its next true quarterback. And Rodgers delays that process once again. At the same time, another quarterback may have become the biggest loser in all of this, Mason Rudolph. Ironically, Rudolph may actually be the player most directly impacted by Rodgers' return. For years, Rudolph has survived in Pittsburgh as the reliable backup option. Coaches trust him. Teammates respect him. He understands the system, and while nobody views him as a franchise quarterback, he has proven capable of stepping in when needed. But now the math becomes brutal. Rodgers is obviously the starter. The Steelers invested draft capital into Drew Allar. They also want to continue developing Will Howard. That leaves Rudolph potentially fighting for a roster spot despite having far more NFL experience than the younger quarterbacks around him. And this is where Pittsburgh faces an awkward decision. Do they carry 4 quarterbacks on the active roster? That is rare in today's NFL. Do they risk exposing one of the younger quarterbacks to waivers? That seems unlikely after investing draft picks into them. Or do they simply move on from Rudolph entirely? Right now, that feels like the most realistic outcome. And honestly, it says a lot about where the Steelers are organizationally. They are trying to compete now while also quietly preparing for the future. But those two goals are starting to clash with each other more aggressively than ever before. Rodgers wants to win immediately. The young quarterbacks need reps and development. The franchise wants playoff success. The fan base wants long-term direction. And somewhere in the middle of all that tension sits Mike McCarthy, who now inherits one of the strangest quarterback situations in the NFL. Because the pressure surrounding Rodgers is enormous. If Pittsburgh struggles early, fans will immediately begin asking about Allar and Howard. If Rodgers plays conservatively and the offense stagnates, criticism will grow louder. And if the season ends with another early playoff exit, the organization may finally have to admit this entire approach failed. That is the risk they accepted when bringing Rodgers back. Because while this move may raise the Steelers' short-term floor, it also lowers organizational flexibility moving forward. And ultimately, that is why so many people view this signing as short-sighted. Not because Rodgers cannot still play, not because Pittsburgh cannot win games with him, but because the franchise once again chose the safer middle ground instead of fully committing to building its future. Maybe Rodgers helps them finally win a playoff game. Maybe he stabilizes the offense enough to keep Pittsburgh relevant. Maybe the gamble works just enough to quiet criticism for another year. But if this season ends the same way recent seasons have ended, competitive record, quick playoff exit, no long-term quarterback solution, then the Steelers will be right back where they started. Only older, only more delayed, and still searching for the future they keep refusing to fully embrace. Breer expects Stefon Diggs to sign for around 1 year, $10, 4 teams mentioned. Sports Illustrated's Albert Breer believes Stefon Diggs is heading toward a short-term deal as he enters the 2026 NFL offseason, projecting a 1-year contract worth roughly $10 million. That number alone already tells you how the league currently views Diggs at this stage of his career. Still productive enough to matter, but no longer treated as a long-term cornerstone at the position. At 32 years old, Diggs is in that uncomfortable NFL category where reputation, production, and risk all collide. Teams know what he once was, a true WR1 who could tilt coverages, dominate one-on-one matchups, and change the structure of an offense. But they also know what comes with him now: age, durability questions, and the reality that receivers rarely age gracefully once they cross the early 30s threshold, especially those who relied heavily on separation and quick twitch ability. Breer's projection of a 1-year, $10 million deal reflects that balance. It's not a prove-it minimum contract, but it's also far from elite receiver money. Instead, it's the type of deal reserved for teams that believe they are one piece away and are willing to accept some volatility in exchange for upside. And that's exactly why multiple contenders are being linked. 4 teams have been mentioned as logical landing spots: the Washington Commanders, Kansas City Chiefs, Atlanta Falcons, and Los Angeles Rams. Each of those situations tells a different story about where Diggs fits in the modern NFL landscape. For Washington, the fit is obvious on paper. The Commanders have a young quarterback in Jaden Daniels and a clear need for a second reliable weapon opposite Terry McLaurin. In that kind of offense, Diggs wouldn't need to carry the entire passing game anymore. Instead, he would function as a high-level complementary receiver, someone who can win isolated matchups and punish defenses that overload attention toward McLaurin. There is also a familiarity factor. Washington has quietly been aggressive in looking for veteran help, and adding a proven name like Diggs would signal a win-now mindset around their young quarterback. The Kansas City Chiefs represent a different kind of opportunity. In Kansas City, Diggs wouldn't be asked to be the guy at all. He would be another chess piece in an already complex offensive system built around timing, spacing, and adaptability. Even though the Chiefs have repeatedly shown they can manufacture production from almost any receiver group, the one thing they still value is veteran reliability in high-pressure situations. Diggs would not replace their core system, but he could stabilize it in key moments, especially in third down and red zone scenarios where precision matters more than raw athleticism. Then there are the Falcons, a team that has been searching for consistent passing game identity for years. Atlanta has invested in offensive talent, but still lacks a true proven WR1 presence. In that environment, Diggs would likely be asked to take on a larger target share than in Kansas City or Washington, but that comes with risk. The Falcons' offensive inconsistency has often limited wide receiver production now, meaning Diggs would need to adapt to a more uneven quarterback and scheme situation compared to more stable contenders. Finally, the Rams make a lot of sense from a Sean McVay system perspective. Los Angeles has a long history of maximizing veteran receivers in short bursts of production. Even when the roster fluctuates, the system itself tends to create opportunities for receivers to thrive. In theory, Diggs would be used in motion-heavy concepts, quick reads, and layered route combinations designed to free him up without requiring him to consistently win in isolation against elite corners. But underneath all 4 destinations is the same fundamental truth. Diggs is no longer being evaluated as a franchise-altering addition. He is being evaluated as a strategic piece for a one-year push. That shift in perception is what makes Breer's $10 million projection so revealing. A few years ago, Diggs would have been the centerpiece of an offense, not a short-term solution in a rotational free agent market. His recent off-field situation also plays a role in how teams are approaching him. Breer notes that Diggs was acquitted in a legal case involving allegations from a former personal chef. While that clears a major external distraction, it does not automatically reset his market value. NFL front offices tend to be cautious with veterans who carry even temporary uncertainty, preferring short deals that limit long-term financial exposure. On the field, however, Diggs still showed enough in 2025 to remain relevant. He recorded over 1,000 yards and more than 80 receptions, proving he can still function as a productive starter when healthy. But even that production now comes with context. Volume statistics alone no longer guarantee elite standing, especially when efficiency metrics and explosive separation numbers begin to trend downward with age. This is where teams are forced to make difficult decisions. Do they trust the name and the resume, or do they prioritize younger, cheaper receivers with more long-term upside? That is why Diggs is expected to land in this middle tier of contracts, valuable but not irreplaceable. From a roster building perspective, the one-year structure is also significant. It suggests that teams are not thinking of Diggs as a multi-year investment, but rather as a rental player for immediate contention windows. That could benefit both sides. Diggs gets a chance to reestablish value on a competitive roster, while teams avoid long-term commit risk tied to age and durability. In the end, the four-team market reflects a broader NFL trend. Elite receivers are aging into short-term mercenary roles rather than long-term foundational pieces. And Diggs, once one of the most feared route runners in the league, now finds himself at the center of that transition. Where he ultimately lands will likely depend less on money and more on opportunity. Who can offer him the cleanest path to targets, production, and one last meaningful playoff run before his career enters its final chapters? Stefon Diggs is back on the market, and this time, the price tag looks nothing like the superstar contracts that defined his prime. According to league expectations, the range is simple. 1 year, around $10 million. A prove-it deal. A reset deal, a show us you still belong at the top kind of contract. For a receiver who once reshaped offenses in Buffalo, that shift says everything about where the NFL thinks this story is going next. Because this isn't just about talent anymore. It's about timing. It's about durability. And it's about which team is willing to bet on a veteran star at the exact moment the league is moving toward younger, cheaper receivers. Short clip moment. Stefon Diggs isn't chasing a payday anymore. He's chasing relevance. And the market is narrowing. Albert Breer outlined 4 teams that make sense: the Commanders, Chiefs, Falcons, and Rams. Each one tells a different version of the same story. Washington sees a need opposite Terry McLaurin and a quarterback in Jaden Daniels who needs a second weapon to unlock the offense. Kansas City sees insurance, a potential upgrade, a way to keep Patrick Mahomes' window wide open. Atlanta is searching for stability in a receiver room that hasn't fully formed its identity. And the Rams? They're always one aggressive move away from changing their entire offensive ceiling. But underneath all of that is a quieter truth. Diggs is no longer the centerpiece of a passing game. He's the missing piece, and that changes how teams evaluate him. Short clip moment. The league isn't asking if Diggs can be WR1 anymore. It's asking if he can still be WR1 level. There's also the context teams can't ignore. Diggs' production in recent seasons has been solid, but not dominant enough to demand long-term commitment. In his most recent stretch, he still posted over 1,000 yards, still showed separation ability, still moved chains. But the explosiveness, the week-to-week takeover ability, hasn't been as consistent as it once was. And in today's NFL, inconsistency gets discounted fast. That's why this contract projection matters. A 1-year, $10 million deal isn't a punishment. It's a test, a way for teams to buy upside without locking into risk. And for Diggs, it's a chance to rewrite the narrative before it fully solidifies. Because once a player reaches this stage of his career, The league stops projecting who he was and starts reacting to who he is right now. That's where Diggs is, right in the middle of reputation and reality. The Commanders represent the most obvious landing spot on paper: a young quarterback, a clear WR2 need, a playoff window that's starting to open. But fit doesn't guarantee urgency. And urgency is what drives these decisions now. Kansas City has urgency. Contenders always do. Atlanta has need, but questions at quarterback. Los Angeles has structure, but competition for touches. Every option comes with a trade-off. And that's the real tension in this market. Stefon Diggs is still good enough to matter, but no longer guaranteed to matter everywhere. So the decision now isn't about where he can succeed. It's about who believes the remaining version of him is worth betting on. And in a league that moves fast and pays selectively, that might be the hardest negotiation of his career. The Cleveland Browns quarterback situation heading into the 2026 season is already under a microscope, but the attention surrounding Shedeur Sanders is beginning to shift from hopeful development story to organizational concern. What was once viewed as a long-term quarterback experiment is now being framed by critics as something closer to a marketing storyline than a true football progression plan. And that perception is becoming louder, especially after recent comments from Deion Sanders about a potential documentary project centered around his son's draft experience and early NFL journey. At the center of this discussion is a simple but uncomfortable question for Cleveland. Is Shedeur Sanders being developed as a franchise quarterback, or is he becoming a brand before he becomes a proven starter? For a Browns organization that has spent decades searching for stability under center, that distinction matters more than ever. Shedeur Sanders entered the NFL with enormous expectations. During his final college season at Colorado, he was projected by many analysts as a potential first-round pick and even a possible top selection depending on team needs. His accuracy, confidence, and leadership made him one of the most talked-about quarterback prospects in the country. However, the pre-draft process became a turning point. Concerns about his pocket habits, decision-making under pressure, and off-field attention began to circulate. Those concerns, whether fair or exaggerated, ultimately contributed to his dramatic slide down the draft board. When the Browns selected him in the 5th round of the 2025 NFL Draft, it was seen as both a value gamble and a developmental project. Cleveland was not handing him a franchise role immediately, but they were investing in his upside. His rookie season reflected that reality. Sanders did not start the year as QB1, spending time behind veteran Deshaun Watson and rookie Dillon Gabriel, before eventually earning opportunities late in the season. In his limited starts, he posted a 3-4 record with roughly 1,400 passing yards, 7 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions. The production was uneven, but not unusual for a rookie thrown into a rotating and unstable offensive environment. The Browns' offense as a whole was inconsistent, lacking rhythm, protection, and reliable receiving options for stretches of the season. That context matters, but it does not erase the fact that Sanders himself struggled with turnovers and decision-making under pressure. For a young quarterback trying to establish credibility, those are the exact issues that can define early perception. Now, heading into year 2, Sanders finds himself in a critical position. The Browns' quarterback room remains crowded and uncertain. Deshaun Watson is still technically part of the picture, though injuries and declining production have severely limited his impact and long-term outlook with the team. Dillon Gabriel, drafted earlier than Sanders in the same class, also remains in the mix despite not showing enough in his rookie year to clearly separate himself as a future starter. That creates a rare and important opportunity. A relatively open competition where performance in practice and preseason could directly determine who gets the starting job. On paper, this should be an ideal development environment. Sanders is no longer a rookie adjusting to the speed of the league. He has experience, game film, and familiarity with the Browns system. If he improves his processing speed, reduces turnovers, and shows command of the offense, there is a legitimate pathway for him to win the job. For Cleveland, that would represent the best possible outcome, a cost-controlled young quarterback developing into a long-term solution. But this is where the narrative begins to shift. Instead of focusing solely on football development, attention has increasingly turned toward the Sanders family's media presence. Deion Sanders, Shedeur's father and a Hall of Fame player turned high-profile coach, recently revealed discussions about producing a 30 for 30 style documentary detailing Shedeur's draft experience and fall to the fifth round. On the surface, this is not unusual in modern sports, where athletes often build personal brands alongside their careers. However, within NFL circles, timing and optics matter. For a second-year quarterback still fighting for a starting role, critics argue that external media projects can become distractions. Whether that distraction is real or perceived, it changes the way players are evaluated internally. Coaches and executives want focus to be directed entirely toward film study, practice habits, and on-field improvement, especially for a quarterback who has not yet proven himself as a consistent starter at the professional level. This is where the criticism of Shedeur Sanders intensifies. Some analysts are now questioning whether his public profile is beginning to outweigh his on-field resume. The concern is not that Sanders is incapable of becoming a starter, but rather that the attention surrounding him is moving faster than his development curve. In a league where patience is limited, especially at quarterback, perception can quickly influence opportunity. From Cleveland's perspective, the situation is straightforward, but delicate. The organization must evaluate whether Sanders is progressing at a rate that justifies long-term investment. His arm talent, confidence, and mobility still give him upside, but the turnovers and inconsistencies must be corrected quickly. At the same time, the Browns are also operating under pressure to end their long-standing instability at quarterback. That means they cannot afford prolonged uncertainty or repeated developmental setbacks. The presence of Deshaun Watson complicates matters further. While Watson's contract and history make him a lingering factor, his injuries and inconsistent performance have reduced his reliability. If he cannot reclaim his former level of play, Cleveland will eventually need to transition fully toward younger options. That puts Sanders and Gabriel in direct competition, not just for the 2026 season, but potentially for the franchise's long-term direction. For Sanders, the path forward is clear but demanding. He must win the starting job through performance, not reputation. He must reduce mistakes, demonstrate command of the offense, and show that he can elevate those around him. The physical tools are not in question. The issue is execution under NFL conditions, where defensive speed, disguised coverages, and constant pressure expose hesitation and inconsistency. At the same time, he must navigate the external spotlight that follows his name. Being the son of Deion Sanders guarantees attention, scrutiny, and constant media framing. That reality will not change. What can change is how effectively he separates narrative from performance. The more he produces on the field, the less external storylines matter. But until that happens consistently, every off-field conversation becomes part of the evaluation. For the Browns, this is ultimately about control and clarity. They need to know whether Shedeur Sanders is developing into their quarterback of the future or simply occupying a developmental timeline while they continue searching elsewhere. The NFL does not wait for potential indefinitely. It rewards production. The upcoming preseason and training camp will therefore be decisive. If Sanders can outperform Watson and Gabriel, he positions himself as the clear leader of the offense. If he struggles, the conversation will quickly shift back toward Cleveland potentially re-entering the quarterback market in the near future. Right now, Shedeur Sanders stands at a crossroads. The talent is still there, the opportunity is still real, but the margin for error is shrinking. And in the NFL, especially at quarterback, that combination defines everything that comes next.